The year is 1845. Britain stands at the height of its power. Its navy rules every ocean, its merchants trade with every shore. The empire believes there is nothing left to conquer, except the top of the world. The Arctic, a place of white horizons and unbroken silence. A region so cold, so empty, that even sound seems to freeze in the air. For centuries it has taunted explorers with a single idea, a shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific, the Northwest Passage. Many had tried to find it. None had returned with the map complete. Now, Britain will try again. 2 ships are chosen, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, veterans of Antarctic discovery, their hulls sheathed in iron, their bows strengthened for the crush of ice. Each carries a steam engine from the new age of rail, and enough provisions to last 3 years at sea. This is not a gamble. This is science. This is empire at its confident peak. At the head of the expedition stands Sir John Franklin, 59 years old, veteran of war and ice. A man who has failed once before in the Arctic and carries that failure like a scar beneath his medals. For Franklin, this voyage is redemption. For Britain, it is destiny. 129 men sign their names to the mission. Sailors, marines, engineers, cooks, and carpenters. They board at the Thames docks in the cool light of May 1845. Crowds gather along the riverbanks. Families wave handkerchiefs. Children shout farewells. It is a scene of pride and of parting. No one watching that day will ever see these men again. The ships glide from the harbor, their black hulls gleaming with coal tar, their decks stacked with barrels and bright new lifeboats. Flags snap in the wind. A brass band plays Rule Britannia. And as the tide carries them seaward, the Arctic waits beyond the horizon. Cold, patient, indifferent. Each vessel is a masterpiece of engineering. Heating pipes run through every cabin. Desalination systems turn ice into drinking water. And deep in the holds, 8,000 tins of preserved meat and soup, a modern miracle of the industrial age. But speed was prized over caution. The tins were sealed in haste with lead, the same metal that would one day fill the bones of Franklin's crew. In July, they reached Disco Bay off Greenland, the last outpost of open sea before the maze of ice. Here they take on fresh meat, send final letters home, and wait for the right wind. When it comes, they turn west. 2 weeks later, whaling ships spot them in Baffin Bay. Erebus leading, Terror behind, sails bright against the fog. The whalers record the sighting in their logs. The ships were in fine order, all well. Then the fog thickened, and they were gone. That was the last time anyone saw the Franklin expedition alive. Within days, they entered the channels of the high Arctic. a place of shifting ice, where compasses spin and daylight itself disappears. They believed they were sailing toward glory. They were sailing into legend. By September 1845, the Franklin expedition had slipped beyond the world's edge. No more towns, no more charts, only cold and compass. Ahead stretched a kingdom of ice, vast, white, and alive with silence. The ships pressed west into Lancaster Sound, the first gateway of the Northwest Passage. Here, the Arctic made its greeting, a sudden freeze, a wall of drifting floes, a taste of what was to come. By autumn, they anchored in a small bay off a barren spit of gravel and stone. Beachy Island. It would be their first winter harbor. The crews built ovens from stone, pitched tents on the shore, stored coal and powder in neat rows. They hunted seals, built snow walls to shield the decks, and kept watch through 20-hour nights. Discipline, Franklin's first commandment, never wavered. Every morning began with prayers. Every evening ended with songs that vanished into the dark. They were strangers in a silence so vast it seemed holy, and for a time, it almost felt like triumph. The men wrote home in their journals. They praised the heating pipes that ran through the cabins, the good rations, the morale. A few even carved chess sets from whalebone. To them, the Arctic was harsh, but conquerable. When the ice broke next spring, they would push on, finish the map, and return as heroes. But spring in the Arctic does not arrive the way it does elsewhere. It creeps, hesitates, and often changes its mind. When the light finally returned, 3 graves stood on the hill above the camp. Petty Officer John Torrington, Private William Brain, Able Seaman John Hartnell. They were buried with ceremony, uniforms pressed, flags folded. Franklin himself read the service. A century later, when scientists uncovered those same graves, the bodies were still there, perfectly preserved by the frost. Faces pale as wax, hair intact, eyes closed. They looked asleep. But the autopsies revealed something their captain could never have known. Lead. In every bone, in every organ. Traces so high they could only have come from the very tins of food that were meant to save them. The miracle of modern preservation had become the expedition's hidden killer. Each meal, each mouthful of soup or salted beef carried another drop of metal into their blood. The poison moved quietly, patient as the ice outside their hulls. By the summer of 1846, the ships broke free and turned south through Peel Sound, chasing open water. They did not know it yet, but Beachy Island was the last place any of them would ever see the sun. Behind them lay 3 graves in the gravel. Ahead waited a continent of ice. And somewhere in between, the Arctic had already chosen its next victims. By late summer of 1846, the expedition moved south through Peel Sound. The ice thinned, the air softened, and for a brief moment, the men believed their luck had changed. They had survived one Arctic winter. Their ships had held. Morale was high. With fair winds, they could clear the straits before the next freeze, and perhaps, just perhaps, reach the open Pacific. But the Arctic doesn't bargain. It waits. And when the time is right, it takes everything back. Without warning, the channels ahead sealed shut. Pack ice, white walls as tall as cathedrals, closed in around them. The ships were trapped. The sea became solid beneath their hulls. There would be no second thaw. They were now prisoners of the Arctic. 129 men, 2 ships, and a silence so vast that even prayers seemed swallowed by it. Still, discipline held. Crozier and Franklin kept order the only way they knew how, through routine. Every morning, the men cleared snow from the decks. They rotated watches, played music in the mess. The fires burned day and night, though the air never grew warm. But beneath the surface, something was going wrong. The same poison that had killed the men at Beechy Island was spreading quietly through the crew. Lead, leaching from soldered tins, from pipes, even from the very water systems that ran through the ships. It built up in their blood, their bones, their minds. One by one, the men began to weaken. They complained of aching limbs, trembling hands, confusion. Their teeth loosened, their vision blurred. Even simple orders took effort to understand. Doctors blamed scurvy. The men blamed the cold. No one suspected that the enemy wasn't outside the hole, but inside. By June of 1847, Sir John Franklin was dead. The cause was never written down. Age, exhaustion, starvation, or simply the Arctic, collecting what it was owed. Command passed to Captain Francis Crozier, a man both respected and quietly feared. An Irish officer, brilliant navigator, but solitary. He had led terror through ice before, but never through despair. He now faced an impossible choice: wait for the ice to melt and risk another winter of death, or abandon the ships entirely and walk south across hundreds of miles of frozen wilderness. He chose to wait. The Arctic chose otherwise. The sun vanished again. For months, the world turned black. The ships lay silent under layers of snow. The fires burned out. The cold claimed the decks, the sails, the breath. The ice did not just trap them, it began to consume them. Timber split, iron froze, and inside those frozen walls, hope broke long before the hole did. The Franklin expedition had crossed the threshold. They were no longer explorers. They were survivors. By the spring of 1848, the Arctic had won. The ships, once symbols of British mastery, were now frozen monuments in a dead sea. No thaw came. No open water. No rescue. Inside, the air was foul. Mold crept across the bunks. The engines stood silent. Coal was nearly gone. Food spoiled in its tins. Men coughed in the dark, waiting for a dawn that never arrived. Captain Crozier knew what the logbooks would never admit. They could not survive another winter aboard the ships. The Arctic had turned their walls into coffins. And so, in April of 1848, the decision was made. They would leave, abandon the ships, take what remained of the provisions, and march south toward the Great Fish River, hundreds of miles away. Civilization lay somewhere beyond the horizon, if such a thing still existed. Before they left, Crozier and his officers placed a message inside a metal canister, sealed it in a stone cairn on King William Island. It read, "H.M. ships, Erebus and Terror, were deserted on the 22nd of April, 1848, 5 leagues north-northwest of this. Sir John Franklin died on the 11th June, 1847. The total loss by deaths in the expedition has been to this date 9 officers and 15 men. We start on tomorrow, the 26th, for Back's Fish River. That note is the last known message from the Franklin expedition. No more logs, no more letters, just silence and footprints leading into the white. 105 survivors left the ships. They hauled sledges across the ice, loaded with food, guns, tents, and strangely, silver cutlery, books, even a small piano. They still believed order could outlast chaos, that the Arctic would yield to discipline and rank. But hunger is a patient enemy. As days turned to weeks, men began to fall behind. Some collapsed and were buried in snow. Others simply stopped walking. The wind covered them before their names could be spoken. Inuit hunters later told of small groups of white men seen wandering along the coast, faces dark with frostbite, eyes hollow, dragging sledges that left red stains behind them. When they finally reached land, they built stone shelters and waited. No one ever saw them again. Years later, searchers found the bones, scattered, sun-bleached, stripped by time, and on some of them, knife marks. London refused to believe it. An empire built on honor could not accept that its heroes had eaten their dead. But the bones do not lie. Science would later prove what pride had denied. The men of Erebus and Terror had marched until they could march no more. Their last footprints led into the white and vanished. The Arctic had taken the rest. They left behind 2 empty ships, a note, and the echoes of a question that still lingers. What do men become when there is nothing left to command but death itself? Back in England, months passed, then years, and still nothing. No letters, no sightings, only silence. At first, the Admiralty was patient. The Arctic, after all, moved slowly. A delay was expected. But by 1848, even patience began to crack. Something had gone wrong. That year, Britain launched its first search, led by Sir James Clark Ross, Franklin's old colleague and one of the greatest navigators alive. He retraced the same route north, his ships cutting through seas thick with ice. He reached Lancaster Sound, the very passage where Franklin was last seen. There was nothing. No ships, no messages, only endless fields of white and silence deep enough to drown in. Ross carved a single message into the Arctic's record: no traces of the expedition. Then he turned back. The search did not end there. Lady Jane Franklin, John Franklin's wife, refused to surrender hope. She became a force of nature herself, raising funds, lobbying Parliament, sending ship after ship into the north. Her determination filled newspapers, salons, even sermons. To her, the Arctic had taken a husband. She would take its secrets. Between 1848 and 1859, more than 30 expeditions searched for Franklin's men. They combed every inlet and island. Some vanished themselves, but the mystery only grew. The first real clues came not from explorers, but from the people who had lived there for generations, the Inuit. Their oral histories spoke of strange ships trapped in the ice and starving white men wandering the coast. They traded artifacts for goods, silver spoons, buttons, medals engraved with the Royal Navy crest. Each relic was a whisper from the dead. In 1854, the Scottish explorer John Ray collected these stories. He listened, carefully, respectfully, and returned with a report that would shatter Victorian pride. The Inuit, he said, had found bodies. Many had been cut apart for meat. Ray's report reached London like a cannon shot. The Empire recoiled. Charles Dickens himself took to the press, calling the Inuit liars, insisting that no English sailor would commit such an act. But truth doesn't bow to outrage. Years later, when forensic scientists examined the bones recovered from King William Island, they found the same marks, cut clean, deliberate, and unmistakable. Hunger had forced the last survivors to eat their dead. It wasn't savagery, it was survival. Still, Lady Franklin pressed on. She financed one final expedition, led by Captain Francis McClintock. In 1859, his men landed on King William Island. There, buried inside a stone cairn, they found the message left by Crozier, the one written before the march south. Nearby, they discovered a small boat on a wooden sledge. Inside were two skeletons. Around them, muskets, tea, chocolate, even silverware engraved with officers' names. Every item neatly arranged. Even in death, they had kept their order. McClintock wrote that the remains were surrounded by the melancholy tokens of a hard fate. He was right. The expedition was gone, but the Arctic had not erased them completely. It had preserved their story, piece by frozen piece. By the time Lady Franklin died, the world had already turned the story into legend. Franklin was remembered not as a victim, but as a martyr to discovery. The ships Erebus and Terror became ghosts on the horizon, symbols of both courage and consequence. The Arctic fell silent again. For more than a century, it would keep its secret. Only the wind, the ice, and the bones remembered the truth. For 160 years, the Franklin expedition lay silent beneath the Arctic ice. The world moved on. Empires fell. Nations changed. But somewhere in the cold waters north of Canada, two wooden ships waited. For decades, searchers tried to find them. Explorers, divers, scientists, each following fragments of Inuit stories, each tracing clues left by ice and time. The Arctic yielded bones, tools, even pieces of clothing, but never the ships themselves. They remained ghosts, always near, never seen. In the early 21st century, the search began again. This time led not by sailors, but by scientists. a partnership between Parks Canada, Inuit heritage groups, and modern Arctic explorers. They called it Operation Nunavut. The team used satellites, sonar, magnetometers, eyes sharper than any compass needle. They studied Inuit oral histories carefully, stories passed down for generations describing two ships trapped in the ice. One near a shallow bay, the other farther north, in deeper water. For years, those accounts had been dismissed by the Admiralty. Now, they were treated as coordinates. In August of 2014, after years of searching, a small sonar drone scanned the seabed of Queen Maud Gulf. And there, at a depth of only 11 meters, appeared a shadow, a perfect silhouette of a ship, hull intact, masts collapsed, decks still sealed tight. It was HMS Erebus. When divers entered the wreck, they found a world frozen in time, plates still stacked on tables, a wine bottle half filled with silt, a leather boot lying by the captain's quarters. Every object exactly where human hands had left it 170 years before. It was as if the ship had gone to sleep, and the Arctic had kept its promise to never disturb the dead. 2 years later, in 2016, another survey team found the second ship, HMS Terror. It rested 24 meters below the surface of Terror Bay, upright, almost untouched. Through remote cameras, the world saw what no one had seen since 1848. Cabins still furnished, drawers closed, a map on a desk, its ink long faded, a quill pen resting beside it. One window remained unbroken, clear as glass. Behind it, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The condition of the wrecks told a new story. One of the ships, likely Erebus, had drifted south before sinking. The other, Terror, may have been recrewed, sailed again for a time by desperate survivors before it, too, succumbed to the ice. Even in their final moments, the men had refused to give up. Inside both ships, archaeologists found relics of daily life: spoons, pipes, uniform buttons, a musket, a toothbrush. One officer's desk still contained a sealed bottle of ink. Its black liquid had not frozen. It waited, as if ready for another entry in a journal that would never be written. Modern forensic science filled in the rest. DNA from recovered bones matched the descendants of sailors still living in Britain. Chemical testing confirmed lead poisoning, scurvy, zinc deficiency, starvation. The expedition had died not from one wound, but from many small ones, each delivered by isolation, ice, and the very technology they trusted to save them. After more than a century and a half, the Arctic had given back its secret, but not its forgiveness. Today, the Erebus and Terror remain on the seafloor, their timbers dark, their decks unbroken. Divers enter only briefly, carefully, recording every artifact before the ice returns to cover them once more. The Arctic had never been cruel. It had only been patient. It kept what was given to it, and when it was ready, it told the story back to us. For more than a century and a half, the Franklin expedition was a story without an ending. Now, the ending lies beneath the ice. When the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were found, The myth became something human again. It was no longer a tale of failure or hubris, but a reminder of what men can endure when faced with the impossible. They did not die because they were foolish. They died because they believed too deeply in empire, in progress, in the certainty that human will could bend nature. The Arctic showed them otherwise. When archaeologists recovered the sailors' remains from King William Island, they did so with reverence. Each bone was cleaned, studied, recorded, then returned to rest in the frozen ground. The soil was mixed with ice and small stones, a tomb that will never thaw. The bones told what the journals never could: starvation, scurvy, lead poisoning, and still traces of discipline, of order clung to even the last moments. Buttons were neatly sewn, belts still buckled. A Bible lay open beside a skeleton's hand. These men did not surrender easily. They were sailors, bound by duty, by ritual, by hope that the next sunrise might bring deliverance. Even as the Arctic erased their names, they clung to the idea that someone, somewhere, would come for them. And someone did. Not in time to save them, but in time to remember them. For modern Canada, the discovery of Erebus and terror was more than archaeology. It was a reconciliation between science and story, between empire and environment. The Inuit, whose oral traditions had carried the truth for generations, were finally recognized as the first and most accurate witnesses. The Arctic remembers everything. The ice forgets nothing. What we call mystery, it calls memory. Sir John Franklin set out to find a passage across the top of the world. In the end, he found something greater, a passage through time itself. Through his tragedy, we learned how small we are against the world's oldest forces. Every discovery since has carried his shadow. Every explorer who sails north hears the same whisper in the wind. You do not conquer the Arctic. You enter it on its terms. Today, the Erebus and terror still lie beneath the water, sealed in darkness, guarded by the cold. Divers who visit say it feels as though the crew has only just stepped away, that if you listen long enough, you might still hear the echo of boots on deck. There are no victors here, no glory, only endurance, only the truth that nature gives back in pieces to those patient enough to listen. The Franklin expedition set out to chart the last blank space on the map. They filled it, not with lines or borders, but with memory. And in the heart of the Arctic night, when the ice groans and the wind moves across the bay, you can still feel them there. The ships, the men, and the silence that became their home.